In the flickering firelight of forgotten caves, before steel, before scripture, before the first brick of any city was laid, humans were already at war. Not with empires or ideologies, but with nature, with hunger, and often, with each other. This is not the tale you were taught in school. This is the buried truth of survival, of fear, and of a primal hunger that occasionally turned man into meat. Welcome to Prehistoric Shadows. Here we do not shy away from the uncomfortable. We confront it. We stare into the abyss of our ancestors' eyes and ask, what made them human? Today, we unravel one of the oldest, darkest threads in our evolutionary past: cannibalism. A behavior that stains archaeological records from Spain to Ethiopia, across Neanderthal valleys and Homo sapiens' icy frontiers. But this is not just a tale of savagery. It's a study in survival, power, spirituality, and desperation. From ritualistic rites to battlefield butchery, cannibalism in prehistory was not always madness. It was method. It was meaning. So let us return to the frozen forests and howling winds of the Paleolithic, where giants walked and predators didn't always have claws. Let us ask, when food was scarce and enemies near, what separated human from beast? And when survival was on the line, did it matter? Archaeology doesn't lie. It whispers, through splintered bones and soot-stained cave floors. And in places like Gough's Cave in England or El Cedron in Spain, the bones speak of something chilling: cannibalism. Not as myth, not as madness, but as method. These were not acts of chaos. They were deliberate. Skulls were not just smashed. They were cleaned, carefully reshaped into bowls or ceremonial vessels. Long bones like femurs were split down the shaft to access marrow, the fatty core that meant the difference between life and death. The marks on ribs, jaws, and joints, not from predators, from stone blades, human blades. This was not scavenging. It was butchery, done with intent and skill. Who were the victims? Sometimes enemies, defeated and consumed to claim dominance. Other times, tragically, they were kin, elders, the weak, or even the brave who chose to be consumed for the tribe's survival. In that brutal landscape, sacrifice took many forms. Cannibalism wasn't always an act of cruelty. It was ritual, a final gift, a return to the group through flesh and fire. In the flicker of torchlight, flesh became fuel, and memory became meat. Cannibalism is often reduced to horror, a final act of desperation in the face of starvation. But for many ancient cultures, it meant something deeper, something sacred. Funeral cannibalism wasn't just a way to survive. It was a way to remember. From Papua New Guinea to prehistoric Europe, consuming the flesh of the dead was an act of love, not desecration. It was believed that through this intimate ritual, the strength, wisdom, and spirit of the departed could be passed on. A father's bravery might live on in his son's bones, a mother's tenderness in her daughter's blood. The dead did not disappear. They were absorbed. To modern minds, that may seem grotesque, but to our ancestors, it was the ultimate honor. A final union before the body returned to earth. A sacred cycle. Flesh to tribe, tribe to memory. But reverence had its shadow. Not all acts of cannibalism were born from grief. Some were rooted in conquest. In war, to consume your enemy was to obliterate them, physically and spiritually. Their gods, their names, their place in the world, devoured. In these moments, death wasn't mercy. It was preparation. When Homo sapiens entered Ice Age Europe, they were not alone. They stepped into the domain of the Neanderthals, a species just as intelligent, just as fierce, and just as desperate to survive. At first, there may have been distance, then uneasy coexistence. But eventually, the silence gave way to blood. This was not a meeting of man and beast. It was a collision between two apex predators. The Cro-Magnons, our ancestors, brought coordination, long-range weapons, and complex group tactics. Neanderthals relied on brute strength, ambush, and up-close encounters. In forests and caves, that gave them the edge. But in open terrain, speed and range ruled, and it was there that the tides turned. When the battles ended, the horror began. Some Neanderthal corpses weren't buried. They were butchered, skinned, dismembered, bones cracked for marrow, flesh stripped clean. This wasn't scavenging. This was processing, deliberate and efficient. These weren't animals. They were kin in the evolutionary chain. But in the Cro-Magnon mind, war didn't stop at victory. It ended with consumption, with dominance made literal. And in this cold, primal world, one species didn't just outlive the other, it devoured it. The Cro-Magnons were not just survivors, they were giants in every sense. Towering over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, they cut imposing figures against the icy backdrop of Paleolithic Europe. Their skulls rivaled modern humans in volume, suggesting not just size, but intellect. When 19th-century scientists uncovered their bones in the caves of France, they weren't sure what they had found. These were not the stooped primitives they expected. These were titans, lost kings of the Ice Age. But they were not brutes. They were artisans of survival. Mammoth ivory became fine-tipped needles and flutes that sang through the cold. Stone became tools. Caves became canvases, painted with red ochre and coal in visions that still whisper across millennia. They buried their dead. They may have worn the bones of their enemies, not as trophies of bloodlust, but as emblems of memory, warning, or power. They stood at the edge of glaciers, firelight flickering in their eyes, crafting more than weapons. They crafted identity. In a world of tooth and frost, they were not prey. They were planners, builders, artists. And when the ice roared, they stood tall and ruled. Bone masks, skulls worn like helmets, rib cages arranged as altars, limbs placed with eerie precision. At the mouths of caves, human remains weren't hidden. They were showcased. These were not the acts of mindless brutality. These were deliberate symbolic displays, monuments of fear, silent warnings to all who approached. This place is claimed in blood and bone. This was psychological warfare before the word existed. In a world without writing, horror was the loudest language. The sun-bleached face of a fallen enemy, stripped of flesh and mounted high, told a story without sound. We are not prey. We are predators. Cross us, and you join them. To rival tribes, these gruesome displays weren't just intimidation. They were ritual curses, territorial markers, and tests of will. Fear was currency, and the Cro-Magnons spent it wisely. Leadership didn't just rely on strength, it relied on spectacle, on making enemies feel defeat before a spear was ever thrown. Today, we drop leaflets. Then, they dropped skulls. And the battlefield wasn't land, it was the mind. The weapon? Memory etched in bone. Fire was life. But in the Ice Age, it was also war. Beneath layers of ash and soot-stained cave walls, archaeologists find not just evidence of hearths, but of horror. The weaponization of fire was one of early humanity's most devastating innovations. In territorial conflicts, humans didn't always fight face to face. Sometimes they let the flames do the killing. To claim a cave, they didn't storm it. They smoked it out, lighting damp brush at the mouth, turning the air toxic, choking out those inside, coughing, blind, vulnerable. Then came the spears. They burned food caches, sabotaged shelters, scorched hunting paths, to starve out rivals before the first blow was ever struck. Fire became a siege engine, slow, steady, and merciless. And unlike bone clubs or flint blades, fire did not rest. It crackled through the night. It spread terror over hills and through valleys. It was chaos, on command. To wield fire was to wield fear. It made warriors into warlords. Those who mastered it didn't just survive the ice. They commanded it. Because in this cold world, victory didn't always come from the blade. Sometimes it came from the smoke. Before the Neanderthals, before Cro-Magnon supremacy, there was Homo heidelbergensis, ancient, towering, mysterious. They roamed Ice Age Europe long before language or art, carving their legacy not in words, but in bones. In the dark recesses of Atapuerca, Spain, archaeologists uncovered a chilling truth. 28 individuals, their remains broken, cut, stripped of flesh. These were not the claw marks of predators. They were the clean, deliberate incisions of tools, wielded by human hands. The story their bones tell is not one of chaos, but of calculation. Skull caps removed, femurs split, marrow harvested. This was butchery, systematic and cold. When the great beasts vanished, mammoths, rhinos, horses, and the wind howled through barren steppes, survival demanded a choice. Sometimes the only meat left was each other. But this was not savagery. This was evolution under pressure. A brutal adaptation in a world that offered no second chances. In these shattered bones, we see something terrifying and profound. The earliest blueprint of human logic, where life was preserved not through compassion, but consumption. Cannibalism wasn't a failure. It was the first rule in the playbook of survival. In the Paleolithic world, survival wasn't measured in days. It was counted in calories. Protein wasn't just food. It was fuel. Currency. A daily wager between life and death. Hunting was a gamble. Seasons shifted without warning. Herds moved, sometimes vanishing for months. When they did, desperation crept in, silent and cold. Nothing was wasted. Not then. Brains, marrow, liver, kidneys, organs modern man discards were prized. Fat was liquid gold. Insects, frogs, even snakes had value. But when the traps were empty and the forest went quiet, when hunger turned from discomfort into danger, they turned to the last reserve. Each other. Some bones were buried with care, honored, remembered. Others were scorched, shattered, scraped down to the last fiber. Archaeological evidence reveals a haunting truth. Human remains were treated just like hunted game, butchered with efficiency, consumed with purpose, not out of savagery, out of necessity. To save the tribe, the dead gave again. In this brutal economy, morality wasn't erased, it was recalculated. Survival was the only law. Because when the cold came for everything, meat was meat. They hunted. They fought. They sometimes fed on their own. But make no mistake, prehistoric humans were not monsters. They were human. United States. Stripped bare by nature's indifference, yet held together by something remarkably enduring: solidarity. In those harsh, unrelenting landscapes, survival meant unity. Small bands lived as one body. Food was shared equally. Elders were not cast aside, they were cherished, keepers of memory and skill. Wounded hunters were tended to, not abandoned. These were not scattered beasts. They were communities, built on trust. Around firelight, language flickered into being. Grunts became meaning. Gestures became stories. Culture was born not from luxury, but from necessity. Even cannibalism, as terrible as it seems, was sometimes an act of love. A parent feeding a child with the last resource left. An elder giving their body so the clan might see spring. In such moments, flesh was not desecration. It was devotion. A final sacrifice. Before law. Before gods. Before names were carved into stone. There was care. And in that care, the first spark of what it meant to be human. They hunted not in safety, but in shadow. Beneath the silent gaze of the moon, when the cold bit deepest and fear lingered in every breath, ancient humans moved with purpose. Firelight flickered against stone walls as they prepared, not for battle, but for something more dangerous: survival. Out there waited death with teeth, cave lions with jaws like bear traps, hyenas with bone-crushing power, saber-tooths that stalked in silence and struck without warning. Man was not born the apex predator. He became it. They hunted in packs, not with brute force, but with unity, strategy. Whistles cut through the night. Hand signals flicked like sparks in the dark. Every motion mattered, every step, life or death. One misstep, one hesitation, and the tribe went hungry, or worse. But when they succeeded, it was more than meat. It was momentum. It was status. The hunter who returned fed not just bellies, but legends. Around the fire, the tale of that kill would be told, etched into memory. So they went again, night after night, into the cold, into the unknown. Not for glory, but because extinction was always waiting. Every hunt was war, and every meal, a miracle. Why stare into the abyss of our past? Because it stares back, not in judgment, but in revelation. These aren't just tales of blood and bone. They are the rough blueprints of humanity, unedited, unforgiving, and utterly essential. Our evolution wasn't a staircase, it was a battlefield. We didn't rise in a straight line. We crawled, through famine, through fear, through firelight and frostbite. We clawed our way forward, inch by inch, learning not just how to survive, but how to become something more. From cannibal fires flickered the first sparks of empathy. From stone blades came art. The same hands that once butchered to endure would one day carve gods, build cities, write love poems on walls. Domination became protection. Hunger gave way to ritual. Memory became meaning. Art, morality, belief. They were not born in spite of our suffering. They were forged in it. To know who we are is to know where we come from. And where we come from is not clean. It is shadow, ash, sacrifice. But it is also where the first light began. To understand ourselves, we must kneel before the bones and listen. We are the descendants of firebringers, bone breakers, and story weavers. Survivors of ice, hunger, and time itself. We did not inherit the earth gently. We wrestled it from fang, claw, and cold. Our story is not polished. It's scarred, carved into stone walls and scattered across burial pits and burned landscapes. But the shadows of our past are not stains to be scrubbed away. They are mirrors. And to understand what it means to be human today, we must be willing to look, unflinching, into yesterday's darkness. The hunger, the fear, the rituals of survival. They were not signs of barbarism. They were the raw materials of consciousness. From those desperate fires, we forged memory. From suffering, we shaped meaning. We are not separate from the blood in our story. We are its evolution. At Prehistoric Shadows, we believe truth is rarely easy, but it is sacred and necessary, because only by tracing our path through blood, bone, and ash can we understand how far we've come. If this journey into humanity's forgotten truths stirred something in you, subscribe. Here at Prehistoric Shadows, we confront what history tried to bury. Every week, we uncover a world where monsters were real, and sometimes they were us. Because only by facing the shadows can we step into the light.